Guatang Island, Cambodia, 1975. The scene before you is almost surreal as the sun dips, casting a peaceful red-orange glow across the horizon. All the while, tracer rounds crisscross the dusky sky and smash into your helicopter. Above the drone of the engine and the whoop-whoop of the blades, you yell into your radio, "Bucktail, you're cleared, hot!" The cryptic words become clear as a fighter jet swoops down and fires a barrage of missiles into the jungle tree line. Which now explodes in fiery red and orange flame. The enemy is fanatical though. After only a brief pause, bullets once again start pounding into the chopper as you try to land. Suddenly your co-pilot yells out, "Missile! 4 o'clock!" You swerve and it just misses. Your gunner rakes the tree line with his minigun as you finally manage to land. On the ground, the din of whirling rotor blades, automatic weapons fire and exploding mortar and cannon rounds drown out even the loudest commands, while the air reeks of spent cordite, jet exhaust and salt spray. The remaining Marines start retreating towards your copter, stopping every few feet to fire their weapons as the Khmer Rouge pour out of the jungle in pursuit. You see a mortar round erupt in a shower of earth. As a screaming Marine is thrown up in the air, the bullets coming in hard and pounding against your chopper. Any more of this and you won't be going anywhere. As the final Marines leap on board, a group of Khmer Rouge soldiers charge towards you, hell-bent on stopping you from escaping. Just as one starts to throw his grenade, the minigun cuts him down, along with the rest of his squad. As the chopper starts to rise amidst the smoke, flying bullets and orange glow of the horizon, you wonder how our easy rescue mission turned into this bloodbath. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Today we cover a truly forgotten operation, one some historians claim can be considered the very last battle of the Vietnam War. After an American cargo ship was captured by Cambodian communists, President Ford sent in a huge force of Marines and helicopters to rescue the crew. So far, it sounds like the plot of a pretty decent 80s movie. Yet, as it always seemed to in the Vietnam War, everything went terribly wrong. Poor intelligence, the inability of the various services to work together, bad luck and political meddling led to a massive firefight and heavy casualties. The botched rescue would be hyped to the heavens as a great victory, but then quickly shoved into the long grass as an embarrassment. 1975 was a turbulent year for Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War was drawing to a close, ending one of the most unpopular wars in US history. And in spite of the thousands of lives and millions of dollars sacrificed, the thing that US planners feared most, the thing that had brought them into the war in the first place, had come to pass. Communist revolutions were sweeping across the region. In April, the North Vietnamese communists marched into the streets of Saigon, leaving them in complete control of the country. America was left reeling from its first lost war. Images of terrified Vietnamese begging to leave on the last helicopters out of Saigon, filling TV screens. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge were advancing on the capital of Phnom Penh, as the pro-US government forces rapidly ran out of ammunition. By the end of the month, they had come to power, led by the soon-to-be infamous Pol Pot. Khmer Rouge literally means Red Khmer, Khmer being the majority ethnic group of Cambodia. While communist, their ideology was one of the most extreme and bizarre versions of it the world has ever seen. What followed was one of the worst periods of mass killing in human history. The Khmer Rouge wanted to transform Cambodia into a society without class. Farmers were forced off their land onto collective fields. There, they were forced to work 12 hours a day with little food. Anyone who tried to gather food to survive was shot for practicing capitalism. Even wearing glasses was seen as a sign of being an intellectual and was grounds for execution. They didn't just stop at class warfare. They were also massive racists. In particular, they hated the Vietnamese with a burning passion. They had been reluctant allies during the Vietnam War, but now they were already at each other's throats. With the fall of Saigon, they demanded the Vietnamese army leave Cambodia completely, but Hanoi took the opportunity to lay claim to some disputed border areas and islands. Ironically, despite the split between China and the Soviet Union, some Cold Warriors in the West still saw the communist world as generally monolithic and controlled from Moscow. If they'd been paying attention, there was a sight unfolding on the Cambodian-Vietnamese border that would have gladdened their hearts. Communists fighting and killing each other as the border dispute escalated. The already paranoid Khmer Rouge regime became even more jittery as the clashes continued, ordering the Cambodian Navy to board potential spy ships or Vietnamese naval vessels. Foreign ships were soon being seized and their crews interrogated, but despite this, no general warning was issued to US merchant shipping. Into these troubled waters sailed the American container ship, the SS Mayaguez, en route to Thailand. The captain, Charles Miller, hoped to avoid trouble by sticking to the international waters off the Cambodian coast. Here there was a problem, however. America only recognized 3 nautical miles off of the coast of Cambodia as water under Khmer Rouge sovereignty, but the new government in Phnom Penh claimed 12 nautical miles as their territorial waters, and the Mayaguez was sailing within those 12 miles. The inevitable soon happened. Khmer Rouge swift boats, ironically built by America and seized from the old regime, appeared and ordered the Mayaguez to stop, sending a burst of machine gun fire across the ship's bow. They tried to keep going, but then a rocket-propelled grenade barely missed the ship. Forced to stop, they were soon swarming with heavily armed Cambodians, demanding they sail for Palawa Island, which was controlled by the Khmer Rouge. After the ship anchored at the island, another group of soldiers boarded the ship to take control of the crew. Their leader told Captain Miller to sail to the city of Ream on the Cambodian mainland. Miller now had a choice to make. Should he sail to Ream as a well-guarded prison cell, or was there some way he could save his ship? Captain Miller's situation was actually much worse than it looked on the surface. That's because the Mayaguez wasn't carrying normal cargo. The ship had put in at Saigon just days before the city fell and picked up sensitive military cargo for the US government. If the Khmer Rouge found out that he was working for the military, the chance of his crew surviving would drop dramatically. Fortunately, the soldiers hadn't bothered to inspect his cargo yet. Interestingly, Whatever was in those containers is still regarded as top secret and has never been revealed. Odds are it was top-secret intelligence-gathering equipment from the US Embassy in Saigon. But I have a podcast to promote, so I'm going to declare it was aliens. Remember, you heard it here first, folks. Captain Miller then almost immediately destroyed a letter he was carrying from the military with his emergency instructions as well. Knowing that saying to Ream would make any chance at rescue even more remote, Miller told the Khmer Rouge that his radar was broken, and with crude sign language, he made it clear that saying to Ream would probably end up with the ship striking the rocks and sinking. The Cambodian commander radioed back to his superiors. They ordered him to drop the anchor immediately and stay put. For the crew of the Mayaguez, Parawa was going to be their prison for the time being. It was a huge stroke of luck, and though they didn't know it at the time, the quick thinking of their captain might have saved their lives. The unwelcome news of the Mayaguez's fate fell upon a deeply troubled America. To borrow a phrase from future President Jimmy Carter, it was going through, quote, a crisis of confidence, end quote. Saigon had fallen only 2 weeks ago, a humiliating end to a painful war. The Watergate scandal had eroded trust in American institutions, while the economy tanked and the nation was held to ransom by the oil-producing countries. With national morale at its lowest point since the Great Depression, things weren't much better at the White House. Gerald Ford had been president for only 8 months since Richard Nixon's August 1974 resignation, and there was a sense of illegitimacy about him. He was not Nixon's first vice president, but took over when his predecessor, Spiro Agnew, resigned over tax evasion. Ford was the first unelected president of the United States, a status his enemies frequently brought up. President Ford declared that the seizure of the Mayaguez was an act of piracy and threatened retaliation, but then ran slap bang into a roadblock diplomacy-wise. Washington knew little about the current situation in Cambodia, and they only had a vague idea about the Khmer Rouge. They didn't have an embassy in Phnom Penh anymore, or any contact with its new government. Farcical scenes then occurred. Controversial Secretary of State Henry Kissinger asked the Chinese ambassador in America to pass on a message to the Cambodians, but he refused and returned it unsent. Instead, Kissinger had to send it to future President George H.W. Bush, then in charge of the unofficial US Embassy in Beijing, to deliver the letter to the Chinese Foreign Ministry in person. They did at least accept the letter and agree to send it to their ambassador in Cambodia. But when their ambassador tried to give it to the Cambodians, he was told he would have to wait for an appointment by the new government. That's international diplomacy for you. As Ford's national security team fumbled in the dark through this information blackout, ironically, the fate of the crew of the Mayaguez soon became the furthest thing from their minds. This was primarily the fault of Henry Kissinger, one of the most controversial figures of the 1970s, and that is really saying something. He was a former Jewish refugee from Hitler's Germany and had transformed himself into the darling of American academia and was a top Washington power broker. In the process, he had become an unlikely pop culture icon, famous for his heavy German accent, shuttling round the world negotiating treaties, restoring US relations with China, winning over dictators, and dating beautiful blondes. However, there was also a darker side to Kissinger, away from the media glitz and distinctive accent. He has been accused of war crimes for the illegal carpet bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War, and the coup that overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile. Not for nothing was Peter Sellers' great comic creation of Dr. Strangelove based mostly on him. Now this brilliant, but flawed man turned his thoughts towards the Mayaguez, with consequences both humorous and tragic. A committed Cold Warrior, Kissinger was very aware that the recent fall of Saigon had left America looking weak, and her worth as an ally in doubt. He wanted to restore US prestige, and the best way to do that was some good old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy. A little flexing of US military muscle would send a message to wavering allies and America's Cold War enemies that the US was still able to kick ass. In the Washington Post, he openly said that, quote, "The US must carry out some act somewhere in the world which shows its determination to continue to be a world power," end quote. The seizure of the Mayaguez was the answer to his prayers. In the first key National Security Council meeting, he slyly said, quote, "As I see it, Mr. President, we have two problems. The first problem is how to get the ship back. The second problem is how the United States appears at this time. Actions that we would take to deal with one of these problems may not help to deal with the other. What we need for the next 48 hours is a strong statement, a strong note, a show of force," end quote. Then looking Ford right in the eyes, he declared that the lives of the Mayaguez crew, quote, "must unfortunately be a second consideration," end quote. In other words, it was more important to send the world a message than actually saving the crew. As one Pentagon official told Newsweek at the time, quote, "Henry Kissinger was determined to give the Khmer Rouge a bloody nose no matter what," end quote. As Kissinger manoeuvred behind the scenes, he was helped by the lingering traumatic memory of the Pueblo affair. This wasn't the first time an American ship had been seized by a rogue communist state. In 1968, the USS Pueblo, a Navy intelligence vessel, was sailing in international waters off the coast of Korea, where it was approached by several enemy patrol ships. The North Koreans boarded the Pueblo and took it back to the city of Wonsan. The ship's crew was then blindfolded and moved to the capital. The US government decided it was too late to respond with force, and 11 months of negotiation followed. Finally, the US was forced to make a humiliating admission that the ship had illegally entered North Korean waters, apologise and promised not to do it again. While the crew was returned, the Pueblo is still in North Korea. It's now open to the public. It's actually a tourist attraction. Ford and his advisors were obsessed with the eerie parallels, determined that this time would be different. They wouldn't make the same mistakes. The hostages would be rescued before they reached the mainland. This really distorted the decision-making process. The Pueblo had been a targeted attack on the US by North Korea, and because of that legacy, Ford's team immediately assumed the seizure of the Mayaguez was also a deliberate provocation. Influential senator and former presidential candidate Barry Goldwater captured this feeling, describing the crisis as, quote, "a little half-assed country taking a shot at us," end quote. In fact, it wasn't. As we saw, a paranoid and insecure regime, already in an undeclared war with its stronger neighbour, was suspicious of any ship near its waters. Everything from Thai fishing boats to a Panamanian freighter had been boarded and seized, normally to be freed days later. As well as convincing Washington that this was a direct assault, the memory of the Pueblo placed Ford's team under a self-imposed time limit. There was no time for diplomacy or sanctions to be given a chance to work. In their minds, this was the Pueblo all over again. They had to act now before the crew was sent to the mainland. It was not only the decision-making process that was impacted, the actual planning of the rescue mission would be rushed as well, with tragic results. In the early morning of May the 13th, US patrol planes passed over Palawan, dropping flares to cut through the darkness. Immediately, Cambodian anti-aircraft guns on the island opened fire on the planes. But it was too late. The pilots had spotted the Mayaguez. Guessing that US Marines would probably be on their way, the Cambodians ordered Captain Miller to start his ship, and to sail to another island, Gua Tang. Then, the Mayaguez was forced to follow several Cambodian swift boats towards the north of the island. But a few hours later, the scream of jet engines cutting through the air returned. The US Air Force had once again spotted the captured container ship. Fighter planes began to circle the ships and fire their guns at the water in front of the swift boats. The message was clear. If you try to move the crew again, you die. Back in Washington, D.C., having opted for a massive show of force, things started to go wrong from the start. The original plan to rescue the crew was to use an assault force composed of men of the USAF 56th Security Police Squadron. 75 volunteers from the 56th will be dropped onto the containers on the decks of the Mayaguez. Even before the combat team had fully assembled, one of the copters, call sign Knife 13, suffered a mechanical failure and crashed at the staging area, killing 23 soldiers and crew. The accident was a grim harbinger of what was to come. After this disaster, they then discovered that the containers on the ship could not bear the weight of the helicopters, while if men rappelled down, they would be exposed to gunfire. Going back to the drawing board, it was decided that it was necessary to wait for the Navy ships to arrive off Gua Tang, and for the Marines to assemble in Thailand before a rescue attempt could be mounted. In the meantime, there were some more dubious dealings from Kissinger. The State Department had received a message from its ambassador in Tehran. A Chinese diplomat had told him, while at an official party given by the Shah of Iran, that China was embarrassed by the Cambodian seizure of the Mayaguez. It was using its influence with Pol Pot's regime and, quote, expected it to be released soon, end quote. This message was received 14 hours before the Marine assault began. What did Kissinger do? He sat on it and didn't share the contents with Ford or his advisors. Not until an investigation in 1976 would the message's existence even be revealed. Kissinger's excuse when it came to light was to claim that he didn't find the source reliable. It is pretty telling, though, that after reading this message, he amped up his lobbying for a military strike. He even cornered Ford after a meeting to demand that, quote, "This is your first crisis. You should establish a reputation for being too tough to tackle," end quote. Meanwhile, the Cambodians were attempting to move the crew to the mainland city of Kampong Som on fishing boats. The idea was that the US planes would be less likely to try and stop them on smaller boats. But once again, fighter planes descended on the ships and fired into the water. After a low pass, one of the fighter crews radioed back to tell the officers that they had spotted the crew on the fishing boats. The attacks were called off because of the danger of hitting the crew, and the fishing boats reached the city around 10 a.m. But the local commander, afraid of provoking an American attack on the city, refused to take the crew. Instead, they were once again moved, this time to the island of Koh Rong Sanom. However, the Americans didn't know this due to faulty intelligence. They thought the hostages were still on Gua Tang. Their plan was to proceed with a simultaneous attack by Marines to retake the Mayaguez, assault Gua Tang, and rescue the hostages, while also hitting Cambodian shipping and bombing targets on the mainland. Just so everyone knew what was really important, Kissinger emphasized that they needed to, quote, impress the Koreans and the Chinese, end quote, with the punitive strikes. You can really feel how much he cares about the crew. If it wasn't bad enough that they were invading an island to rescue hostages that were no longer there, poor intelligence continued to undermine this mission. The Americans thought they would be facing 20 to 30 Khmer Rouge militiamen, poorly armed and poorly motivated to resist the Marines. Instead, They would actually be facing 150 to 200 loyal veteran troops equipped with anti-aircraft guns and RPGs. They'd even fortified bunkers and trenches. The reason why the island was so heavily armed wasn't because of the threat of US troops, but because of the Vietnamese, who were threatening to invade and reclaim the disputed island of Gua Tang. Little did the Marines know that they were flying straight into a kill zone. Worst of all, the Defense Intelligence Agency did know about the strength of the Khmer Rouge defences on the island, but this intelligence was never passed on to the operational planners due to security clarification issues. In a truly remarkable accomplishment, the planning for this assault combined complete chaos and extreme micromanagement. It was chaotic because no one was in overall command. Every service, from the Marines to the helicopter pilots, were doing their own things independently, with only a rough idea of the overall plan. The micromanagement came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff back home. They seem to have become obsessed with minor details. For example, they demanded that the landings happen at exactly 5:42 a.m. on the dot, not a minute earlier or later. What difference it would have made if they'd landed at 5:43 was never explained. They also bombarded the planners with useless information. One officer involved in the planning was told that a major general needed to give him urgent top-secret intelligence immediately. This vital intelligence turned out to be that there were no snakes on the island. Gee whiz. It says it all that this pointless information got through the bureaucracy, but not that the island was swarming with heavily armed Khmer Rouge. Meanwhile, back with the crew, upon their arrival at Koh Rong Salom, Captain Miller was taken to the senior Khmer Rouge commander, where he was subject to a brief interrogation before being asked if he could talk to the American planes from the Mayaguez. The commander explained that they had already lost 3 boats and numerous men, and were anxious to call off the American bombers and end this whole incident. Miller explained that if they returned to the ship and restarted their engines, they could then generate electricity to call their office in Bangkok, which could then contact the US military. It was decided that they would return to the ship the following morning, the 15th of May. That's right, the Cambodians wanted to hand the hostages back. Not only were the Marines hitting the wrong island, there was actually no need for this rescue attempt at all. Meanwhile, the planning for the assault went on. It was decided that Gua Tang Island was so covered in jungle that there were only 2 viable landing zones available. These were beaches on the west and east shores of the northern portion of Gua Tang. A diversionary assault would be launched on the western shore, while the real assault would come from landings on the eastern shore. As they were afraid of injuring the crew that was supposedly being held on the island, no airstrikes or naval bombardments were allowed to soften up the defences. That meant all those trenches and bunkers I previously talked about were all still intact when the Marines arrived. On the 15th of May, the doomed rescue mission began. The first part was easy and went off without a hitch. The USS Holt drew up alongside the Mayaguez, while helicopters saturated the whole ship with tear gas. As the Marines stormed aboard, they found it was completely empty. The focus quickly turned to Gua Tang, where 8 helicopters filled with 200 young Marines who had not completed training, much less seen any combat, were already on their way. When the Khmer Rouge commander on the island, M. Som, heard the distant thump of helicopter blades, he roused his men and sent them to their battle stations, where they prepared a lethal array of weaponry: anti-aircraft guns, large machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and small arms. They waited for the Americans' arrival in their fortified bunkers. While the Marines were minutes away from landing, interesting developments on the hostage situation began to unfold. The Khmer Rouge Information and Propaganda Minister, Hu Nim, made a radio broadcast announcing that the Mayaguez would be released. Quote, "Regarding the Mayaguez ship, we have no intention of detaining it permanently, and we have no desire to stage provocations. We only wanted to know the reason for its coming and to warn it against violating our waters again. This is why our Coast Guard seized the ship. Their goal was to examine it, question it, and make a report to higher authorities, who would then report to the royal government so that the royal government could itself decide to order it to withdraw from Cambodia's territorial waters and warn it against conducting further espionage and protractive activities. This applies to the Mayaguez ship and to any vessels like the ship flying Panama flags that were released on the May the 7th, 1975. End quote. This was dismissed by the White House as a trick. The Marines kept on flying, while American bombers pounded targets on the Cambodian mainland. An increasingly frantic Khmer Rouge government released the crew, only insisting that they sign a document stating that they hadn't been mistreated. Then they were handed over to the crew of the SS Henry B. Wilson, stationed off the coast of Guatang Island. According to a Newsweek article at the time, when news of their release reached the White House, quote, "The President and his Chief of Staff exchanged whoops of joy, Henry Kissinger beaming ear to ear, the lot of them celebrating what seemed in that taut midnight to be a famous victory." End quote. With all that celebrating, they seemed to have forgotten something. The bombing strikes at the rescue mission were not called off. The young Marines were about to invade the wrong island to rescue hostages that not only hadn't been there in the first place, but had now actually been released. It was also filled with battle-hardened Khmer Rouge troops and strong defences. The scene for a tragedy had been set. As Knife 21 pilot Lieutenant Colonel John Denham touched down the beach in the western landing zone, his Marines began to stream out the back ramp. Just as they did, the tree line lit up as concealed Khmer forces let loose with automatic weapons, rockets and mortars. Holding steady for the Marines to scramble down the ramp, one of Denham's two engines was severely damaged by enemy fire. With Knife 22 laying down suppressive fire with its miniguns, Knife 21's crewmen jettisoned everything they could. The damaged chopper skipped across the waves, taking on water as Denham fought to keep it airborne for nearly a mile before it ditched into the sea. On the eastern beach, things were going even worse. As the choppers tried to offload their Marines, a murderous crossfire erupted. Knife 23, piloted by First Lieutenant John Schramm, began taking punishing hits to its rotor system. Pounded by bullets and RPGs, the tail section tore off, and Schramm wrestled with the controls as the helicopter crashed into the beach. Miraculously, no one was killed, and the shaken Marines scrambled to the tree line for cover. Knife 31 wouldn't be nearly so lucky. "This is a hard landing, Sandy! Give me all the cover you can!" you yell at the sergeant as he blasts away at the tree line with his minigun. An RPG smashes into your chopper, and warning alarms begin to blare out all around you. You can see the tracer bullets from heavy machine guns knifing through the sky, pounding into the metal walls and shaking the whole helicopter. "We won't last much longer. We've got to get out of here." Even your co-pilot is firing back out of his window with an M16. Then your heart stops as you see another RPG shooting through the sky towards you. As it hits, a massive explosion erupts. Pain sears through your body, and you know you are badly injured. Dazedly, you look at your feet, and you're startled to see that nothing remains of the cockpit and the instrument panel that had been in front of you. The chopper is on fire and is hurtling towards the ground, the alarms blaring in your ears. The chopper is on fire and is hurtling towards the ground. You try to talk to your co-pilot, but his eyes just stare lifelessly back at you. The sight awakens you from your daze, and you frantically wrestle with what's left of the controls, desperately trying to pull the chopper out of its death loop. This really happened. The last RPG that hit Knife 31 ignited its left fuel tank and ripped away the nose of the helicopter. Although seriously injured, the pilot, Major Corson, somehow managed to maintain enough control to settle the aircraft down in the water. A badly burned Marine tried to unharness the limp body of the co-pilot, but, under heavy fire, he was finally forced to abandon the attempt. 4 men were shot and killed or drowned near the burning wreckage of Knife 31. A 5th, stunned and wounded, stumbled his way nearly 100 yards to the tail ramp of Knife 23 before he was cut down. In all, 13 men aboard Knife 31 were killed. 13 survivors, including Major Corson, were picked up at sea after using the Knife 31 wreckage as a shield, then swimming into the surf to escape. Among the survivors was Marine Lieutenant Terry Tonkin, who, while swimming away from the beach on his back and with enemy bullets sending up geysers all around him, used Major Corson's small survival radio to call in airstrikes. 3 out of the 8 initial assault helicopters were down, 2 on the beach of the eastern landing zone, 1 a mile at sea. An hour into the assault, only 54 Americans were on Guatang, about 1/3 of the number planned, and they were split into 2 groups. The day's battle was just getting started, and it's safe to say that things were not going well. The situation was deteriorating fast, with the 25 Marines trapped on the eastern beach in the worst condition. Recognizing this, the Kaimers used them as bait to lure more helicopters into their deadly crossfire. Several attempts were made to rescue the trapped Americans. First Lieutenant Charles Greer, pilot of helicopter Jolly 13, took heavy fire all the way into the landing zone near the wreckage of Knife 23. With rounds smashing into his chopper, Greer touched down the beach while his crew raked the shoreline with their miniguns. Although in sight of the rescue copter, the Americans were pinned down by deadly Cambodian fire and unwilling to break cover. Jolly 13 remained in its exposed position, taking punishing hits from heavy automatic weapons, with Greer worrying that his would be the 3rd helicopter to litter the eastern beach. With no hope of recovering the men at the tree line and his helicopter engulfed in flames, Greer pulled back from the landing zone and nursed his chopper, peppered with 35 bullet holes, severe rotor blade damage, and fuel, oil, and hydraulic leaks, back to the Thai mainland. On the western beach, they were still trying to land more Marines, but the misadventures of Jolly 41, piloted by First Lieutenant Thomas D. Cooper Jr., reveal how difficult that was. Cooper made 4 attempts to land on the beach with his Marines, but was driven back after being pummeled by heavy fire and mortar attacks. Eventually, a helicopter gunship destroyed some Khmer Rouge positions, allowing Cooper to make his 5th attempt. While mortar rounds walked towards them, 10 Marines managed to get out the back of Cooper's aircraft, before one of the rounds landed only 10 feet from the tail rotor, forcing Cooper to abort and lift off with 5 Marines still on board. As he returned to hover for the last Marines to finally disembark, a mortar round passed through the rotor blades and exploded only 20 feet away, blowing a hole in the copter's belly. Forced to give up, Jolly 41 withdrew for the last time, with the remaining 5 Marines still on board, and returned to its staging base in Thailand. It was so severely damaged, it was out of use for the remainder of the operation. By 9 a.m., the mission was already something of a fiasco. 131 Marines and 5 airmen were now stuck on Guatang, split into 3 groups. Those on the western side of the island were divided into 2 positions, 82 in one group and 29 south of their position on the same beach. They had tried to link up, but had taken heavy casualties, including the death of Lance Corporal Ashton Looney. The other 25 were isolated across the neck of the island near the eastern beach. Just 5 choppers were still in working order. With the crew of the Mayaguez confirmed as released, Ford and his advisors now got round to declaring the rescue operation to be aborted. I am sure that was great comfort to the Marines trapped on the beaches. It wasn't a simple matter to remove the Marines. Now they were locked in a life-or-death battle on the island. Especially on the eastern beach, they were dangerously close to being overrun. The rescuers need rescuing, and to do this, 100 more Marines were landed on the island to secure their positions. That's right. Even though the hostages had been saved and the crisis declared over, more American troops were being thrown into the Guatang killing fields. American planes were also still bombing targets on the Cambodian mainland. Heavy fire meant the eastern beach was still too hard to land on, but reinforcements did reach the western beach. It's rather ironic that all these resources managed to get to the western landing zone, as in the original plan, it was meant to have just been a feint to distract from the main action in the east. One of the true heroes of this mission now stepped off a helicopter and leapt into the fray. Sergeant Fofo Tuiteli, nicknamed Sergeant T by his men, an enormous 6'2", 250-pound Samoan man who had done numerous tours of duty in Vietnam. He'd been awarded the Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. When he arrived, the Marines were running out of ammunition and were being pinned down by machine gun fire and mortar rounds. A lieutenant turned to him and said, quote, "I think we're goners, Sergeant." End quote. Spotting an enemy machine gun position on a ridge at the north end of the beach that was raining down fire, making it impossible for helicopters to land, Sergeant T took the initiative and decided to take it out himself. "Incoming!" yells a fellow Marine as a mortar shell smashes into the beach. Sand exploding up into the air, closely followed by lethal machine gun fire pouring out of the tree line. Taking cover behind a rock, you try to return fire, but then an enemy bullet ricochets off the stone and almost hits your head. "We need to do something about that damn machine gun," you yell at Sergeant T. He just smiles. "I'm going to take care of this problem. You coming?" As your unit provides covering fire, you both sneak into the jungle. Hugging the soft, muddy floor, you slowly crawl around behind the machine gun posts. The gunners, dressed completely in black, with red cloths around their necks, are so focused on killing your friends that they are blind to your presence. As one, you open fire and rake their bodies with bullets. The surprised Khmer Rouge, unable to even turn around before they meet their maker. As Sergeant T leaps into the machine gun nest, you see a movement out of the corner of your eye. Swinging around, you're just in time to kill a Cambodian soldier emerging from the jungle, machine gun raised. Seemingly without a care in the world, the sergeant is already grabbing an AK-47 and numerous other souvenirs. "Time for some more hunting before we go back," he says, smiling fiercely as you both melt back into the jungle darkness. After silencing the machine gun and going on an epic killing spree, Sergeant T emerged from the jungle, carrying 2 AK-47s, Cambodian cigarettes and Ho Chi Minh sandals. He even joked that, quote, "They're having a garage sale on the other side of the island," end quote. His commanding officer, Dick Keefe, was checking their northern perimeter when he saw Tui Telly carrying the AK-47s. Quote, "I asked him where he'd been all morning, to which he simply replied, 'Looking for some souvenirs, sir,' end quote. Later, some Cambodian soldiers climbed up a huge tree overlooking their position, hoping to fire on them from above. Cool as a cucumber, Sergeant T lifted an M60 machine gun off its stand and fired it from his hip. As he raked the palm tree with bullets, men began to fall out of it like apples in an orchard. By about 2 o'clock, the Khmer were running out of ammunition and retreated briefly into the jungle to regroup as the Americans occupied their bunkers. During a short break in the action, Sergeant T handed out AK-47s, canteens, binoculars, rubber tire sandals, and Cambodian cigarettes to the grateful young Marines. He had a massive impact on morale, especially as for most of these young troops, this was their first experience of combat. It would only be a temporary reprieve, however. Un Som's men discovered their main ammo dump was still intact and hadn't been overrun by the Marines. Mainly because, once again, the intelligence collection for this mission had been absolutely terrible and the Marines didn't know it existed. Soon the Khmer Rouge were returning to the beaches and the hardest fighting of the day occurred. The Cambodian soldiers repeatedly tried to overrun the beaches as the Marines desperately held on. Up above, planes pounded the island with napalm, rockets, white phosphorus, and even 15,000-pound daisy cutter bombs. The daisy cutters were the largest conventional explosive weapon the US had at the time. Only a nuclear bomb was more powerful. Despite all this, it wasn't until 6:15 p.m. that the first Marines began to be rescued from the island. On the eastern beach, the Jolly Green 11 had to hover over the beach rather than land due to the wreckage of previous helicopters. The extraction was difficult because the helicopter would seesaw up and down, and only a few Marines at a time could board the copter's rear ramp in this fashion, by timing their jumps to coincide with the downward motion of Jolly Green 11. The copter was hit numerous times, but managed to transport its cargo of 20 Marines and 5 airmen to the USS Coral Sea. As the West Beach was slowly evacuated, the defences of the remaining Marines were weakened. Sensing this, the Cambodians charged out of the jungle and put them under intense pressure, fighting sometimes going hand to hand. With dusk falling and the retreat becoming increasingly chaotic, the last 27 Marines fought their way on board Knife 51. However, Air Force Tech Sergeant Wayne Fisk was worried that they may have left some people behind. He ran through intense fire in a half-crouch across the beach, and it was lucky he did, because he spotted 2 young Marines laying down suppressive fire, unaware the helicopter was about to depart. Fisk got their attention, and the 3 sprinted for the chopper and clambered up the ramp just as it lifted off. 41 Americans had died. Many more were badly injured. Cambodian casualties were about the same. Even worse, in the chaos of the evacuation, it was discovered that 3 Marines had been left behind. A SEAL team led by Tom Coulter was preparing to launch a search and rescue mission, but then Vice Admiral Coogan told him they wanted to wait until dawn. They would drop flyers on Gua Tang announcing their intention to recover the Americans' dead, and then send Coulter and his team in unarmed and under a white flag. In an act of defiance still celebrated by SEALs to this day, Coulter refused the Admiral's, quote, suicide mission, end quote. Marines Lester Guddy McNamara and Captain James Davis volunteered to return to the island the next day under a white flag. When the Admiral rejected even this, his original plan, tempers boiled over. Later that night, USS Henry Holt Commander Robert Patterson called Coulter into his quarters for a conference call with the White House. Although he does not remember who was on the call that cancelled the rescue operation, Coulter did remember that, quote, someone on the call had a very strong accent, end quote, and was the most dubious about attempting a rescue. I doubt it will ever be conclusively proven, but there was likely only one man that met that description in Ford's senior team, Henry Kissinger. What a guy. The Free Marines, PFC Gary Hall, Lance Corporal Joseph Hargrove, and Private Danny Marshall were on their own. Their fate was a mystery until fairly recently. A couple of days after the raid, a Cambodian soldier was carrying wooden poles near the water well when he saw a man lurking in the jungle. Quote, "Who are you?" he asked with irritation. "Why don't you help me carry the wooden poles? And are just trying to run away." End quote. When the mysterious man ran for his life, the soldier put down his load and squatted next to the well to draw water, and noticed strange boot prints. These were not Cambodian. They were American. The Khmer Rouge assembled a search party and later shot the Marine. Likely, this was Joseph Hargrove. Hall and Marshall were captured trying to steal food from Khmer troops. Sent to the mainland, they were last seen getting into a car to be transported to the headquarters of the Khmer Rouge naval commander, Mies Muff. It is believed they were tortured and then executed on Muff's orders. At first, the operation was seen as a success, and Ford's approval rating rose. Kissinger crowed that America had shown it still had teeth. As the high casualty rate and details of just how chaotic the whole affair had been leaked out, it quickly turned into a scandal. Kicked into the long grass as an embarrassment, most of the veterans wouldn't get any acknowledgement until the 21st century. Fittingly, the names of those who lost their lives on Gua Tang are now inscribed at the end of the Vietnam War Memorial. The whole affair's biggest impact was on the development of America's special forces. The lack of coordination, specialist training, and intelligence revealed America couldn't launch such operations successfully without massive reform. This was further underscored 5 years later with the doomed mission to rescue American hostages in Iran, Operation Eagle Claw. Ultimately, these failures led to the creation of the U.S. Special Operations Command. Efforts were made during the 1990s and early 2000s to recover the dead left at Gua Tang and bury them stateside. 5 still remain unaccounted for, including the Free Marines who were left behind. I hope they do try again to bring those young men home at last. The whole Mayaguez incident was a fitting end to the Vietnam War. Launched by politicians more concerned with matters of prestige than anything else, it was plagued by poor coordination, bad intelligence, and operational failures at every level. And just like the whole war, it would be the average soldiers who would pay the price. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. I am now going to take a 2-week break for the holidays. We will return on the 5th of January in the new year. I have some exciting topics lined up for you, including the Spanish Civil War, Britain's worst defeat in the Middle East during World War I, and the escapades of William Walker, the American mercenary who fought his way to ruling over Nicaragua. Happy holidays, everyone. See you in 2026 for more Forgotten Wars.